December 12, 1945. A forgotten gravel road somewhere deep in the clay heart of Mississippi. The engine of the GMC CCKW truck gives a final shuddering cough and dies. Silence crashes down, broken only by the whisper of a wind that feels like it's scraping bone. Inside the canvas-draped bed of the truck, over 150 German women huddle together, a single shivering mass of gray wool and fading hope. For them, the war isn't over. It has simply changed shape, transforming from the familiar terror of bombs and artillery to this cold, alien quiet. They are the defeated, the debris of a fallen empire, now cargo being hauled to a place called Camp Clinton. One of them, a young woman named Liesl, just 21 years old, presses her face against a crack in the canvas. Her breath fogs the frigid air. Outside, the landscape is a smear of skeletal trees and rust-colored mud, dusted with a sugar-thin layer of snow that does nothing to soften its harshness. This is America. It looks nothing like the posters in Berlin. It's not a land of glittering cities or decadent playgrounds. It is a vast, empty wilderness, more intimidating than any battlefield she ever imagined. Liesl had been a Luftwaffenhelferin, a communications assistant for the German Air Force. She'd spent her war in a concrete bunker, connecting calls for officers whose confident voices slowly frayed into desperation as the Reich crumbled around them. She never fired a weapon, she never saw a dead body up close, but she is a prisoner all the same. The canvas flap is thrown back. A raw gust of wind tears through the enclosure. Two American soldiers stand silhouetted against the pale, unforgiving sky. Their faces are grim, chapped red by the cold. They wear the olive drab of the U.S. Army, their M1 Garand rifles held loosely, almost casually. The command is sharp, guttural, in a language they barely understand. "Everybody out, now, rouse!" Panic, cold and sharp, flutters in Liesl's chest. They have heard the stories. For years, the party newspapers and radio broadcasts of Dr. Goebbels had painted a vivid picture of the Americans. They were barbarians, gangsters, degenerates who would show no mercy. The stories whispered among the prisoners on the long, nauseating sea voyage from Le Havre were even worse, filled with predictions of brutality and violation. Every woman in this truck carries that fear like a second frozen heart. They clamber down, their movements stiff and clumsy from cold and exhaustion. The thin soles of their worn shoes offer no protection from the frozen ground. Many are sick, their bodies ravaged by the meager rations of the final months in a collapsing Germany. They have been traveling for weeks, shunted from one transit camp to another, and the journey has stripped them of everything but a raw, animal instinct for survival. Here, on this desolate road, that instinct screams that the end is near. The women form a ragged line, their heads bowed against the wind. Their uniforms are a mismatched collection of Wehrmacht surplus, stained and thin. Their faces are pale, their eyes hollowed out by hunger and dread. The American guards walk the line, their boots crunching on the frozen gravel. One of them, a young corporal with tired eyes, tries to get a head count. He speaks and the words are lost to the wind. All the women hear is the harsh, foreign sound of the enemy. Then it begins. A woman near the front of the line, a former nurse from Hamburg whose name no one knows, sways on her feet. Her eyes roll back in her head, and she collapses without a sound into the thin layer of snow. A moment later, another follows, then a third. It's a chain reaction of human misery. Malnutrition, hypothermia, and sheer terror are claiming them. Their bodies, pushed beyond every conceivable limit, are simply giving up. Liesl watches, her own legs trembling violently. She bites her lip until she tastes blood, trying to will herself to stay upright. To fall is to be weak. To be weak is to be left behind. To be left behind is to die. Within minutes, dozens of women are on the ground. Some are unconscious, others are weeping softly, their sobs lost in the keening wind. Those still standing can only watch, frozen by a combination of cold and a paralyzing fear. They look at the American soldiers, expecting the inevitable: a curse, a kick, a rifle butt. They expect the cruelty they have been told is their destiny. The guards look at the scene, then at each other. Their sergeant, a heavy-set man named Master Sergeant Miller, walks over to his driver, who is staring hopelessly at the truck's dead engine. There is no flicker of sympathy on their faces, only a grim, unreadable resolution. For the German women lying in the snow, it feels like a death sentence has just been passed.
Master Sergeant Frank Miller was 40 years old and tired of war. He'd seen enough death in the Ardens to last a lifetime, and this post-war assignment, babysitting the remnants of Hitler's armies in the middle of Mississippi, felt like a bizarre epilogue to the whole bloody affair. He looked at the scene before him: a broken-down 2.5-ton truck, a stalled convoy, and nearly 200 German women collapsing in the bitter cold. His orders were simple: get the prisoners to the designated female compound at Camp Clinton. But orders never accounted for this kind of logistical nightmare. His radio man was struggling to get a clear signal back to the camp, the air thick with interference. They were stranded. The women on the ground were no longer soldiers or enemies. They were just shivering heaps of misery, their faces blue with cold. The one still standing looked at him with a terror he recognized. It was the look of people who had lost all agency, who expected nothing but pain from the world. He had seen that look in the eyes of concentration camp survivors just 8 months earlier. It was a look he never wanted to see again. Propaganda had told his men these women were fanatical ideologues, cogs in a Nazi machine. But looking at them now, weeping in the snow, they just seemed like broken girls, a long, long way from home. "God damn it," Miller muttered to his corporal, a kid from Ohio named Jensen. "They're gonna freeze to death right here if we don't do something." Corporal Jensen nodded, his gaze fixed on a young woman helping another to her feet, only for both to stumble back to the frozen earth. "What are we gonna do, Sarge?" For a moment, Miller weighed his options. He could enforce strict military discipline, force the women to their feet, keep them moving in place. But he knew it was useless. They were too far gone. He made a decision that wasn't in any field manual. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "You two, get into those woods. Start gathering firewood, anything that'll burn, now." To 2 other soldiers he barked, "You men, help me move the ones who can't walk. Get 'em over there, into that ditch. It's out of the wind." The German women watched in stunned silence as the American soldiers moved into action. But their actions were not what they expected. There were no blows, no threats. Instead of rifles being raised, axes were swung against dead pine branches. Instead of being herded like cattle, the weakest among them were being lifted, gently but firmly, and carried to a shallow ravine that offered a small measure of shelter. Lizel felt strong hands grip her arms. She flinched, bracing for impact. But the American soldier simply guided her toward the others, his face a mask of professional neutrality. The touch was not cruel, it was efficient, helpful. Within 15 minutes, the soldiers had built the base of a massive bonfire. With a splash of gasoline from a jerry can, the damp wood roared to life, sending a column of sparks into the gray sky. The heat was a living thing. It washed over the prisoners, and the sensation was so intensely pleasurable it was almost painful. Hesitantly at first, then with more urgency, the women shuffled closer, holding out their frozen claw-like hands to the flames. The light flickered across their faces, illuminating tears that now streamed not from fear, but from a dizzy and incomprehensible relief. Just then, a jeep came bouncing down the road from the direction of Camp Clinton. The radio man had gotten through. It skidded to a halt, and 2 more soldiers jumped out, hauling massive steaming thermoses and boxes of supplies. Sergeant Miller took charge immediately. "Get those mugs filled, hot soup and coffee for everyone, and pass out these blankets." An American soldier, a boy no older than Lizel herself, approached her with a tin mug filled with a dark steaming liquor. He didn't smile, but his eyes were not unkind. He pushed the mug into her hands. She stared at it, her mind unable to process the gesture. This was the enemy, The monster from the posters, and he was giving her hot coffee. She took a sip. It was bitter and strong, and the warmth spread through her chest, a thorn that was as much emotional as it was physical. Soon, another soldier came by with a ladle, filling a second mug with thick, hot vegetable soup. The smell alone was overwhelming. She ate it ravenously, spoon after spoon, the simple nourishment feeling like the most profound act of grace she had ever known. All around her, the same scene was playing out. German women who hours ago were certain of their imminent demise were now wrapped in U.S. Army blankets, huddled around a blazing fire, drinking hot soup provided by their captors. They looked at the American soldiers, who now stood guard at a slight distance, watching them with an awkward, almost shy demeanor. The propaganda had been so clear, so absolute. These men were supposed to be animals. But animals didn't build fires for their enemies. They didn't offer them blankets and feed them hot soup. In the flickering firelight on a desolate Mississippi road, the entire edifice of Liesl's indoctrinated reality began to tremble. The foundation was cracking, and through that crack, a terrifying and liberating question began to emerge. If this was a lie, what else was a lie?
The repaired convoy finally rolled through the main gate of Camp Clinton as dusk settled, painting the Mississippi sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. The entrance was imposing, tall fences topped with barbed wire, watchtowers manned by armed guards. It was every inch a prison, and the familiar knot of fear tightened once more in Liesl's stomach. The brief, surreal interlude of warmth on the roadside was over. This, she thought, is where the real cruelty begins. But as the trucks rumbled deeper into the camp, the reality was once again jarringly different from her expectations. Camp Clinton was not a squalid pen, but a sprawling, meticulously organized compound. The barracks were simple wooden structures, but they were laid out in neat roads along paved roads. There was an order here, a sense of purpose that stood in stark contrast to the apocalyptic chaos of the Germany they had left behind. They were driven to a separate, isolated section of the camp, designated solely for the female prisoners, away from the much larger compounds that held thousands of their male counterparts, including captured German generals. The processing began immediately, and it was a lesson in cold, impersonal American efficiency. They were stripped of their filthy uniforms, their few pathetic belongings confiscated and itemized. They were marched into a delousing station, a humiliating but necessary ordeal, where they were sprayed with DDT powder before being pushed under streams of shockingly hot water. For women who hadn't felt truly clean in months, the simple act of a hot shower was a near religious experience. They were then issued new clothing, U.S. Army surplus fatigues, rough but clean, sturdy boots, and fresh undergarments. Dressed in the uniform of their enemy, they felt their old identities slipping away, leaving them anonymous and strangely unburdened. Their first meal in the mess hall was another profound shock. They lined up, expecting the watery turnip soup and black bread that had been their sustenance for the past year. Instead, they were served thick slices of meatloaf, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, and white bread with butter. There was milk to drink, coffee with sugar. To a starving person, it was a feast of unbelievable proportions. The women ate in a stunned, ravenous silence. Some, unaccustomed to such rich food, became ill. Most simply ate until they could eat no more, overwhelmed by an abundance they had been taught no longer existed anywhere in the world. A new reality began to dawn. In this place of captivity, they were safer, warmer, and better fed than they had been as free citizens of the Third Reich. The routine of camp life took hold with relentless precision. Wake-up calls before dawn, roll call, barracks inspections, assigned work details in the laundry, the kitchens, the infirmary. The days were monotonous, governed by bells and whistles and the commands of American WACs, Women's Army Corps personnel, who acted as their guards. The WACs were professional, strict, and distant. There was no fraternization, no personal conversation. And yet, there was also no overt cruelty. The discipline was firm but fair. Punishments were for rule infractions, not for sport. Liesel was assigned to the laundry. She spent 10 hours a day in a steam-filled room, washing and folding clothes, her hands raw from the harsh soap. The work was exhausting, but it was mind-numbing, and that was a blessing. It kept her from thinking too much about her family in Dresden, whom she hadn't heard from since the firebombing. It kept her from dwelling on the gnawing uncertainty of her future. The camp was a cocoon of routine, a place where the basic necessities of life were provided for, but at the cost of freedom and identity. But the physical safety of Camp Clinton created a new kind of prison, a psychological one. Stripped of their uniforms, their ideology, and their purpose, the women were forced to confront themselves. In the long, quiet evenings in the barracks, the silence was filled with unspoken questions. The war was over. Their cause was lost. Their leaders were dead or on trial. Their country was a ruin, occupied by foreign armies. Everything they had been raised to believe in, to sacrifice for, had turned to ash. They were survivors, adrift in a world they no longer understood. The Americans had saved them from the cold, only to deliver them to a profound and terrifying emptiness. And in that void, the first seeds of a terrible truth were about to be planted.
The re-education began subtly. At first, it was just newspapers left in the common areas. American papers, like Stars and Stripes, filled with stories and photographs that painted a picture of a world utterly alien to them. Then came the books, literature that had been banned and burned in Germany for over a decade. But the true assault on their indoctrination began in a makeshift movie theater set up in one of the larger barracks. Attendance was mandatory. The women filed in, their faces sullen and suspicious, and sat on hard wooden benches. The American camp commandant, a stern-faced colonel, spoke briefly through a German-speaking interpreter. He explained that they were about to be shown official films, newsreels compiled by the Allied Expeditionary Forces. He said it was important that they see them, that they understand the true nature of the war they had fought. The projector whirred to life, casting a flickering beam of light onto a white sheet tacked to the wall. The first images were familiar enough: German cities in ruins, columns of weary refugees, the faces of hungry children. The women watched in somber silence. This was their reality. They had lived this. But then, the film shifted. The narrator's voice, speaking in translated German, grew colder, more factual. The screen showed Allied soldiers, Americans, British, using bulldozers. Not to clear rubble, but to push mountains of emaciated human bodies into mass graves. The location name appeared on the screen: Bergen-Belsen. A wave of confusion and revulsion swept through the room. Liesel stared, her hands clenching into fists. This had to be a trick, a crude piece of enemy propaganda, just like the ones their own government had produced. The bodies were too thin to be human. They were skeletons draped in skin. But the camera did not lie. It moved with a sickening intimacy, lingering on hollow eye sockets, on skeletal limbs tangled together in a final obscene embrace. It showed the survivors, walking ghosts in striped pajamas, their eyes vacant with a horror beyond comprehension. The film moved on: Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. Each name was a hammer blow. The images grew monstrous, more undeniable. Gas chambers, their walls clawed by the fingernails of the dying. Ovens still filled with human ash. Warehouses piled to the ceiling with shoes, with eyeglasses, with children's toys, with mountains of human hair. This was not the glorious Reich they had served. This was an industrial-scale slaughterhouse. A low moan began to spread through the barracks. Some women turned away, unable to watch. Others began to sob, deep, guttural sounds of pure anguish. A woman who had been a proud member of the Bund Deutsche Mädel, the League of German Girls, vomited onto the floor.
Liesl felt a cold, spreading numbness. Her mind desperately sought an explanation, a defense. "We didn't know," the thought screamed inside her head. "I worked a switchboard. I passed along messages about troop movements and supply convoys. I knew nothing of this." But did she? She remembered the whispers about the camps in the East, the jokes told by SS officers about special treatment for Jews and political prisoners. She remembered the disappearance of her Jewish neighbors in 1942, their apartment sealed, their existence erased overnight. At the time, it was easier not to ask questions. It was safer to believe the official narrative, to trust the Führer, to focus on her duty. Now, in this dark room, thousands of miles from home, the flimsy justifications crumbled into dust. Not knowing was a choice. Willful ignorance was its own form of complicity. The film ended. The projector clicked off, plunging the room into a ringing silence, broken only by the sound of weeping. The women sat stunned, paralyzed by the enormity of what they had just seen. The truth had been revealed, not as a persuasive argument, but as a brutal, irrefutable image burned directly onto their souls. The kind American soldiers who built them a fire and gave them soup were not the monsters. The monsters were the men they had revered as heroes, the men they had trusted, the men in their own uniforms. Liesl looked down at her hands, the hands that had connected the calls, that had passed the messages. She felt a shame so profound, so corrosive, it felt like it was dissolving her from the inside out. Her tears finally came, hot and silent. She was not crying from the cold, or from hunger, or from the fear of her captors. She was crying for a world she now realized had been built on a foundation of unimaginable evil, and for the horrifying, sickening fact that she, in her own small way, had helped lay the stones.
The film screenings shattered the prisoners of Camp Clinton. The days that followed were shrouded in a thick fog of collective shock and grief. The camp's routine continued its relentless rhythm. The whistles, the work details, the roll calls, but the women moved through it like automatons. The mess hall, once a place of quiet relief, became a chamber of silent shame. Eye contact was avoided. Conversations died before they could begin. Each woman was alone, trapped in the wreckage of her own conscience. The American camp administration, however, did not leave them in that abyss. The purpose of showing the films was not to break them, but to begin the arduous process of rebuilding them. The next phase of re-education began. German-speaking American officers, many of them Jewish intellectuals who had fled Germany in the 1930s, held mandatory discussion groups. At first, the women were hostile and withdrawn, their denial a fragile shield against the unbearable truth. But the officers were patient. They didn't lecture, they asked questions. They presented facts, documents, and eyewitness testimonies that corroborated the horrors shown on film. Slowly, painfully, the women began to talk. They spoke of the pressures of conformity, the fear of the Gestapo, the seductive power of Nazi pageantry and promises. They tried to explain how they could have lived alongside such evil without seeing it. Liesl found her voice in one of these sessions. She spoke of her pride in serving her country, a pride now curdled into a deep, bitter poison. "We were told we were making Germany strong again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We believed we were the victims, surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy us. They never showed us the camps, they showed us parades." Alongside the discussions, the Americans introduced a new program, Education for a Different Future. They opened classrooms within the compound. The women were offered courses in English, American history, and civics. They learned about concepts that sounded like transmissions from another planet: democracy, freedom of the press, the rule of law, human rights. They were taught vocational skills, typing, sewing, bookkeeping, designed to help them rebuild their lives in a post-Nazi Germany. For Liesl, the English class was a lifeline.
Learning a new language was like building a new room in her mind, a place untouched by the lies of the old one. Her teacher was a wax sergeant from Pennsylvania, a woman with a kind smile who corrected her grammar with gentle patience. One afternoon, the sergeant brought in a copy of Life magazine and helped them translate an article about a small town in Ohio. They saw pictures of a high school dance, a town hall meeting, a family having a picnic. It was a world of bewildering, breathtaking normalcy. A world where people could disagree with their government and not be sent to a camp. A world that was not fueled by hatred. The kindness they had first encountered on that frozen Mississippi road was no longer a confusing anomaly. They now understood it as part of a larger philosophy. The Americans were not just their jailers, they were attempting to be their teachers. By treating them with a dignity they had been denied under their own regime, the Americans were demonstrating the very principles they taught in the classrooms. The fire, the soup, the clean barracks, the education, it was all part of the same lesson. Months passed. The oppressive Mississippi heat of summer gave way to a mild autumn. The transformation among the women was palpable. The vacant-eyed shock had been replaced by a quiet, somber resolve. They still carried their shame, but it was no longer a paralyzing weight. It was a scar, a permanent reminder of a past they must never allow to be repeated. In early 1946, the announcement came. They were going home. The news was met not with wild celebration, but with a complex mix of relief, anxiety, and a strange sadness. They were returning to a country they barely recognized, to families they may never find. They were no longer the same women who had been loaded onto the truck a year earlier. They were not the arrogant believers in a master race, nor were they simply defeated enemies. They were something new, something forged in the crucible of captivity and truth. On the day of their departure, as Liesl stood on the deck of a transport ship in a New Orleans port, she looked back at the American shoreline. It was the land of her imprisonment, but it was also the place where her mind had been set free. She thought of that terrible day on the frozen road, of her certain belief that she was about to die. She remembered the shock of the fire, the taste of the hot soup, the first crack in the wall of lies. It was a simple act of human decency, a flicker of warmth in a world gone cold. But for her, and for the hundreds of women who stood with her, that single flicker had been enough to light the long, difficult path out of the darkness.